Welcome to Capitol Hill. Well, yesterday it was competing media appearances from the Prime Minister and the opposition leader on the issue of how to deal with asylum seekers. Today, the two were writing letters to each other. The Prime Minister has offered Tony Abbott a briefing on the implications of the High Court decision and the options for processing asylum seekers. Tony Abbott has accepted the offer. The Prime Minister is now in New Zealand at the Pacific Islands Forum, world away from bad opinion polls. Joining me to discuss the day's events are Liberal MP Paul Fletcher and Green Senator Scott Ludlam. Welcome to you both.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Scott, the government's strategy with continuing bad opinion polls seems to be to hang on and hope, to keep doing what it's doing in terms of pushing its agenda through. Is that all it can do?
I think getting on with the job is certainly a big part of it. There's really important matters before the Parliament at the moment, whether you consider telecommunications bills and the build of the NBN, or indeed the climate bills that will be in front of the Parliament over the next couple of months. We tend not to focus on opinion polls, which come and go, and just get on with the job, and I think that's good advice for the government as well.
Are you, though, concerned in any way that the government at this stage on these numbers would lose an election and any reforms you've worked with the government on could be unwound?
Yeah, but there's no credible proposition of an election happening, this side of Christmas, really. So I think people just need to keep their heads. We're just getting on with the job and planning on an election being held on time. The Labor Party has a working majority in the House of Representatives, and that is how government works in Australia. And so we're planning on this government going full term, and we've got a lot of work to do between now and then.
Paul, do you think the news poll is a reflection of the way people would vote, or do people use polls now to send a message to the government they're not entirely happy with what the government's doing?
Well, look, I think we don't put too much store in the polls as they come from week to week. What, on the coalition side, we're very influenced by is what people are telling us about this government. And people are very concerned that we have a government that is not up to the job, a government that just can't do the basics of sound administration. I mean, if you look at the Malaysian People Swap deal, this was announced before it had been bedded down properly, and it really does strain the credulity that they hadn't properly checked the operation of Section 198A of the Migration Act, and they hadn't properly planned against the contingency that the High Court might have taken the interpretation that it has. But when you add that to a whole range of other things that this government is doing, including imposing a $23 a tonne carbon tax at a time when our economy increasingly seems to be slowing, this government continues to run massive deficits year after year. People are very anxious, based upon the feedback I get and my colleagues get, that we have a government that is just not up to the job and is not tackling the problems that need to be tackled.
Yet, Paul, if you look at the Parliament, the government's getting legislation through the Parliament. It's getting things like its plain paper packaging for cigarettes through the Parliament. The economy, while it's hitting some bumps, is better than any other developed economy. So there are some measures on which the government is doing well, aren't there?
Well, the government likes to trot out these statistics about the number of bills that go through the Parliament, but they're rather a misleading statistic, in fact. If you just take one example, there was a bill that went through in the last session, the sole purpose of which was to extend the deadline for the national curriculum to come into force because they realised that they were running late. I mean, so you really need to look into the detail of this, but if you look at the way that the government is actually operating, they are simply proving not to be capable of taking a systematic, steady approach to working through the issues that face them. I mean, the root cause of the problem that they've got with this Malaysian People Swap deal, for example, is that since the Rudd government came to power in 2007, they've been trying to walk two sides of the street, and it's just not been clear what their actual objective is in terms of asylum seekers and their policy there. And if you look, for example, at the way they dealt with the live exports issue, all of a sudden, in a blind panic following a story on Four Corners, live exports were halted, and it took quite a long time to get live exports starting again. Now that has a huge impact on livelihoods, that has a huge impact on business activity, and that unfortunately is the pattern of this government in area after area.
Scott, the Greens did a deal, signed an agreement that helped put Labor into government. Do you have any regrets about that?
No, not at all. If you look at the things that were in that agreement, we've actually ticked off most of the important matters on that list. We're on the verge of getting a parliamentary budget office that'll be able to provide independent costings of political parties' election commitments. The carbon price instrument is on the verge of being debated in the Parliament, and that's a big one. There's a range of accountability measures. We've got dental care. We've got rapid rail on the agenda for the East Coast. Those are all things that we're really proud of. And so no regrets at all, apart from maybe be nicer if some of them had happened a bit faster.
If we could go now to the...
Sorry, Lyndal, can I just comment on that? This claim, and we heard it from Bob Brown again this morning as well, that we've got rapid rail on the agenda. Let's just be honest about this. This is a $20 million feasibility study which has identified that there is an enormous financial challenge if a very fast train is ever to be built. And so what in fact that is yet another example of a bit of political window dressing by the present government, responding in this case to pressures from the Greens, and so much of what they're doing in other areas is also responding to pressures from the Greens. And one of the problems that Australians have with this government is that they don't have a sense that it actually knows what it is there to do and that it has a measured plan to achieve its objectives.
If we could go now to the issue of asylum seekers. Paul, yesterday Tony Abbott was offering to assist the government in any legislative change it thinks is necessary to put the option of offshore processing beyond legal doubt. Today he seems to be limiting that option to either Nauru or Manus Island. He says he can't be the government from opposition, but isn't that what he's trying to do?
Well, look, what we've consistently said is that we believe the most practical solution is to reopen the facilities in Nauru. We have investigated that. Both Tony Abbott and Scott Morrison, our leader and our immigration spokesman, have been to visit Nauru. Julia Gillard at the Pacific Islands Forum this week has the perfect opportunity to have those discussions directly with the government of Nauru. They've said that they are going to sign up to the Refugee Convention, which would immediately remove one of the issues that was raised in the High Court decision as a blocker to the Malaysian deal. And so what we want to see is a workable, well-managed plan to deal with the processing of asylum seekers in a way that does not give people in other countries an inadvertent encouragement to take a dangerous, risky trip on a boat and come to Australia. We want to see our borders secure.
But can you offer assistance and then limit the assistance you're prepared to offer?
Well, what we want to do is assist this government to find a practical, workable solution to the problem of dealing with asylum seekers. It's failed to come up with a practical and workable solution ever since the 2007 election when the Rudd government came to power. We've had a consistent position on this, and we are very happy to assist the government to achieve a workable practical solution, including, if necessary, assisting it to amend the legislation if its legal advice says that would be necessary.
Scott, the Greens want processing onshore, as does the left of the Labor Party. Do you think the government should have any role in trying to stop people making the dangerous journey across the seas to Australia?
Yeah, of course they should. I don't think that's in dispute at all. I think working with partners in the region and in transit countries in particular to try and prevent people from embarking on these risky journeys is precisely what we should be doing, and it's what the government there's been cross-party consensus on that for years. The problem in trying to outsource our human rights obligations and transferring people to places like Nauru and just leaving them on these little islands is that it doesn't act as an effective deterrent. And all it is really doing, I think, is undermining, our commitment to international law, but it's traumatising people who are fleeing war zones and areas where people are being tortured and so on. The thing to keep in mind with this is that nearly all of the people who are assessed, whether it be onshore or Christmas Island or wherever the coalition's got in mind, are found to be genuine refugees. But we're putting them through months and in some cases years of trauma in detention. I think the solution actually now, in the wake of this High Court decision, is staring the government in the face. Stop jumping every time Tony Abbott barks come to the table. There's no need for amendments to the Migration Act. Let's start processing people in Australia and just put the issue to rest.
Should there be any limit, though, to the number of refugees Australia accepts, or should it accept anyone who arrives on shore, is processed and determined to be a genuine refugee?
Well, you've just kind of read back to us what our obligations are at international law. That's how these instruments work. If you reach the country, then you have the right to claim asylum, and if you're fleeing legitimate political persecution or war, you have the right to be resettled here. And, you know, parking people on Christmas Island or on Manus Island or wherever needs to be, any deterrent factor that the government has in mind needs to be scarier than war or torture or persecution. And you can't compete with the factors that are driving people to leave. So what I would appreciate really would be for Tony Abbott to simply back off and stop trying to run foreign policy from opposition and cool the debate and stop inflaming hysteria.
If we could go now to the carbon tax legislation, because we haven't got much...
Can I just comment on that very quickly?
Just quickly, because we don't have much time.
If we're going to cool the debate, let's have a cool, clear debate on pull factors and what encourages people to come here, because if you're going to be a responsible party prepared to govern Australia, you've got to have an answer to the question, what do you do if people just keep coming and coming and you lose control of the borders? And I didn't hear an answer to that question in what Scott was saying there.
And losing control of the borders is precisely the kind of language that's problematic. Take a look at the numbers of people who are on the move worldwide, the numbers who could be on the move if climate change really starts to bite and coastal communities are flooded. You know, we've got a small number of people who reach Australia, and we owe it to them, not just because of our legal obligations, we owe it to them as human beings to treat them with compassion, particularly the kids who are fleeing some of these situations.
If we could go now quickly to the carbon tax legislation, it will go into Parliament next week. Scott, are you prepared, are the Greens prepared to guillotine the legislation if that's what it takes to get it through by the end of the year?
Look, the Howard government did that quite a bit, particularly when they controlled both houses of Parliament. There was a guillotine on all kinds of stuff. We tend to treat that as a last resort, so I think it's way too early to be looking at those sort of options now.
Paul, the legislation on the numbers appears like it has the support. It will get through the Parliament. Should the opposition try to delay it at all?
Well, it's not a question of delaying it. It's a question of making sure that it's open to proper scrutiny and that the Parliament, on behalf of the people of Australia...
That was the question that Lyndal put. Yeah, I think we do need to give... It's going to be a complex package of bills, and Parliament does need to look through it. It'll go through the committee process, and then it'll be subjected to reasonable debate. And, you know, I think it's probably not worth talking any further than that in the hypothetical until we get there. If there's rampant abuse of the Senate process or of the parliamentary process, then of course we'd look at what options are available.
Paul, are you prepared to let the legislation go through, or will the opposition do whatever it takes to try and delay it?
No, it's not a question of doing whatever it takes. It's a question of there being a proper parliamentary process, including committee scrutiny, and we're not in the business of making any assumptions about how the independents or anybody else are going to vote on this issue. First of all, we all need to see the detail of the legislation, which we haven't seen yet. Once we see the detail of the legislation, then all parties obviously need time to consider that, and there should also be a proper committee process, and I just suggest that one possibility could just as easily be a House of Representatives committee process as the Senate.
I'm sorry, that's where we have to leave it. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
And thank you for joining Capitol Hill today.
On 9/11.